Karen had always considered herself a pillar of the neighborhood, or at least she wanted everyone to think so. Her manicured front lawn and perfectly placed flower beds weren't just signs of her obsession with control, they were her badge of authority. And lately that authority had stretched beyond the boundaries of her property, spilling over onto her neighbors. It started innocently enough. A few comments at the block party, a whispered suggestion here and there. But then, Karen took matters into her own hands. She'd started sending out letters, official-looking ones, complete with a logo she had designed herself. She called it the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, an entity that, despite having no legal standing, had begun to send waves of fear through the neighborhood. Neighbors who'd never even met Karen were suddenly receiving stern warnings about minor infractions. Your lawn decorations are not up to code, or the shade of blue on your mailbox is deemed offensive to the community aesthetic. Most of the neighbors shrugged it off, at first, but the complaints kept coming. First, it was the young couple who had painted their door a bright, cheerful yellow. Then, it was the elderly woman down the street who had the audacity to hang a wind chime. Too loud, Karen insisted. And just last week, Karen had gone after the Delgados for placing a Halloween decoration that was inappropriate for their front yard. Tension was thick in the air. Neighbors were on edge. Karen's power had become undeniable, and the small suburban block that once thrived on mutual respect had begun to divide. People whispered behind closed doors about her. Was she really in charge? Was there even an HOA? Some neighbors laughed it off, while others fumed in silence. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, Karen had crossed a line. Jessica Trent, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for standing her ground, had received yet another letter. This time Karen had gone too far. It wasn't just about the garden gnome that Jessica had placed at the end of her driveway. No, this time Karen accused her of violating an entirely fictional rule: failure to display appropriate seasonal decor. Jessica couldn't help but laugh at first, until the fine print at the bottom of the letter caught her eye. It wasn't a fine or a warning anymore. It was a threat. If this issue is not resolved by 7 p.m. tonight, further action will be taken. Jessica wasn't someone who took kindly to threats, especially from someone like Karen. No one in the neighborhood had dared challenge her authority, but Jessica wasn't about to let this woman dictate her life. As she paced around her living room, stewing over the absurdity of it all, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her neighbor, Frank. Karen's at it again. This time she's going after you. You've got to stop her before she makes things worse. You're the only one who can. The words hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. The nerve of Karen. She had no right to control people, to manipulate them with her fake rules. The feeling of being pushed to the edge was more than she could take. At 6:45 p.m. the doorbell rang. The clock was ticking. Karen stood at the doorstep, her posture stiff and authoritative. Her arms were crossed, eyes scanning Jessica with a sense of superiority that made her teeth clench. "You're late," Karen said coldly, holding up a clipboard. "I'm giving you one final chance to fix the issue with your lawn gnome before I have no choice but to escalate this matter." Jessica's eyes flickered to the clipboard, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "Karen, you don't get to make the rules around here. Not anymore." For a moment Karen faltered, clearly thrown off by the directness in Jessica's tone. But then she straightened up, her lips curling into a tight smile. "You think you can just ignore the HOA? The people I represent won't stand for it." Jessica's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a gnome. It was about the control Karen had been slowly exerting over everyone. Jessica wasn't the only one fed up. "You're right," Jessica said, stepping forward. "But I think it's you who doesn't realize who you're messing with." Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile turning into a sneer. But before she could respond, Jessica made her move. In one swift motion, she yanked a document from her back pocket. One she had prepared in secret. It was official. It was real. "You've been playing HOA president," Jessica said, the words dripping with satisfaction. "But now, you'll face the real thing." Karen's face drained of color as she read the document. A legal notice from a law firm. One that had been contacted by Jessica after she learned of Karen's fake HOA. It wasn't just a warning, it was a lawsuit. Karen's smug demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. "You can't do this." But Jessica's smile was already widening. "Watch me." And just as Karen opened her mouth to speak, the sound of footsteps from behind her made both women turn. A shadow loomed in the doorway. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Someone else was here. Someone she hadn't expected. The door creaked. "Open wider." "Are you sure you want to continue this, Karen?" a voice called out. Karen froze. It was the last person Jessica would have expected. The one person who had been hiding in the shadows of this suburban nightmare for far too long. The suspense was unbearable. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. John stood in his kitchen, sipping his coffee, his gaze fixed on the morning sun breaking through the window. The small suburban neighborhood had only been his home for a few months, but he had already observed enough to know that something was off here. He'd seen it all before: frauds, cons, people trying to exert power where they had none. His years as a U.S. Marshal had shown him the darker side of human nature, and it had hardened him in ways most people couldn't imagine. But this was different. Karen was different. The way she carried herself, the faux authority, the self-proclaimed rules, the way she manipulated others into submission with threats and intimidation, wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous. A woman like that, with the wrong kind of power, could ruin lives. John wasn't one to make waves, not unless it was necessary. He preferred to blend in, stay out of the drama. Most of his neighbors hadn't even noticed him yet. But that was starting to change. He was getting the feeling that Karen's influence was spreading like a poison through the block. And sooner or later, it would come for him, too. He placed his coffee cup down and glanced at the clock. It was almost time to head to the office. But just as he moved to grab his keys, a loud thunk at his front door caught his attention. He opened it to find a letter, the familiar logo of Karen's so-called homeowners association, staring back at him. His gut tightened. The letter was brief, as usual, filled with threats disguised as formalities. Failure to comply with neighborhood decorum. It was the usual absurdity, but this time something caught his eye. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The letter wasn't just targeting someone's lawn gnome or mailbox color. This time, it was about him. Failure to display appropriate seasonal decor and a lack of community engagement noted. The following will be addressed immediately unless rectified by 6:00 p.m. today. John's heart skipped a beat. It was too personal. Karen hadn't just targeted another neighbor. She had gone after him. But why? He hadn't done anything to draw attention. He'd only kept to himself, observed from the sidelines. His thoughts raced. Was she just going after everyone now? Or had she somehow figured out who he really was? Could she have looked him up? It wasn't out of the question. His background wasn't exactly hidden. U.S. Marshals had a certain visibility. But why, after all this time, was she going after him now? A flicker of unease settled in his stomach. Karen's actions were always a step ahead, a strategy designed to pressure people into submission. But she didn't know him. Not yet. And she had no idea who she was messing with. John crumpled the letter and tossed it aside, his expression hardening. It was time to stop watching from the shadows. He moved to the hallway and grabbed his coat, tossing a glance at the mirror by the door. The man staring back at him wasn't the type who stood. Buy and let people like Karen tear apart a community. He was a U.S. Marshal, trained to handle situations like this, quietly, methodically. He had dealt with bigger threats, more dangerous people, in far darker places than this sleepy little neighborhood. But Karen had made a grave mistake by making it personal. He left the house, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He hadn't revealed his identity to anyone yet. In this neighborhood, he wasn't a U.S. Marshal. He was just John, the quiet guy who kept to himself, who never got involved. But as he passed Karen's house, he saw her standing in the window, her eyes watching him like a hawk. She had no idea who she was dealing with. John stopped at the mailbox, his fingers brushing the cold metal. A thought lingered in his mind. A warning. It's only a matter of time before she pushes too far. A faint breeze swept through the street. As he turned, heading toward the center of the neighborhood. The calm before the storm. But what Karen didn't know, what no one knew, was that John had been trained for chaos. His past was one of constant pressure, quick decisions, and a singular focus on the mission. And right now, the mission was clear. It was time for him to reveal his true identity. But first, he needed to know what she was hiding. As John walked deeper into the neighborhood, the sound of a distant siren echoed through the air. The kind of siren you don't hear unless trouble is already close. His hand twitched at his side, instinctively reaching for something that wasn't there. But the unease settled again, this time with a greater weight. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And if Karen wasn't careful, she'd soon discover that the one she had been bullying wasn't the man she thought he was. John's thoughts turned sharp. There was no turning back now. He had been the silent observer for too long. Let's see how she reacts when the real U.S. Marshal steps into the spotlight. As he walked into the street, the air around him seemed to thicken, heavy with impending confrontation. And this time, Karen wouldn't be the one holding the power. The HOA meeting was set for 7 p.m., and John arrived early, slipping into the back of the community hall, under the cover of a fading sunset. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a handful of neighbors trickled in, a mix of nervous energy and skepticism hanging in the air. John scanned the room, noting the familiar faces. Frank, the quiet mechanic, Mrs. Delaney, who always carried a shopping bag full of homemade cookies, and a few others who, like him, kept to themselves. At the front of the room, Karen stood poised, one hand gripping a clipboard with a self-important flourish. She was talking animatedly to a group of residents who appeared uncomfortable but too polite to argue. John's sharp eyes caught her every move. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, and tonight she would learn that some things couldn't be manipulated. John took a seat at the back, folding his arms and leaning against the wall, waiting. The murmurs quieted as Karen took her position at the podium, her smile tight but brimming with authority. She looked like a queen in her own mind, ready to assert her dominion over this humble neighborhood. "Good evening, everyone," Karen said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I'd like to remind you all that this is an official meeting of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association." She emphasized the word official with an exaggerated nod. "I will be going over the new guidelines, effective immediately. We've had a few infractions that need to be addressed." John felt the tension rise in the room. He could see the skepticism in the eyes of the others, the polite nods masking their growing frustration. This wasn't a neighborhood meeting, it was a performance. And Karen was the director. "As I've mentioned in my letters," she continued, looking down at the clipboard as if reading from a sacred text, "there will be fines for any violations of the HOA rules. Branches extending over fences, unapproved yard decorations, improper mailbox colors. These will no longer be tolerated." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Frank raised his hand. "Excuse me, Karen," Frank said, his voice cautious. "I've lived here for over 20 years. And I've never heard of any HOA until now. What's the legal standing of this association? Karen's lips twitched into a smile that wasn't quite a smile. The Oak Ridge HOA was founded on the principles of community and order, she replied, voice silky but dismissive. I'm sure you've seen my letters, Frank. The rules are clear. You're not actually an official HOA, though, right? Because I didn't sign up for this, Frank said, his tone more challenging now. Karen's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, John stood up, his height and presence commanding attention. His voice was calm, controlled. I have a question, too. Karen turned toward him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face when she saw the stranger standing in the back, his face unreadable. Yes? She asked, her voice icy but laced with condescension. I'm new to the neighborhood, John began, his hands casually resting in his pockets. But I've noticed you've been enforcing some rules that don't seem to exist in any official capacity. What gives you the authority to impose fines? A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Eyes flicked nervously between John and Karen, sensing the tension building. Karen stiffened but quickly recovered, her smile returning, more forced now. I'm the leader of this community, Karen replied, her eyes narrowing. And it's my responsibility to maintain order. If you have a problem with that, perhaps you should consider moving. The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat. John held her gaze, his expression unreadable, but beneath the calm exterior, his thoughts raced. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I'm not going anywhere, John said, his voice steady but firm. But I'd appreciate it if you could clarify what exactly gives you the right to fine people. Are you even authorized to do so? Karen's gaze flickered, her control slipping just slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. Her smile turned brittle. Let me make it clear, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. The HOA is here to enforce standards. Standards that you all agreed to when you moved into this neighborhood. If you don't like the rules, you can leave. John took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. It's not your rules, he countered. It's your personal vendetta. The room went silent. Karen's face flushed with anger. She leaned forward, her grip tightening on the clipboard. I will not be disrespected in my own neighborhood, she hissed, her voice low, full of venom. Then, as if flipping a switch, Karen shifted gears, her voice taking on a mocking tone. Oh, and I'm sure you're all thrilled to hear that. A fine will be issued to Mrs. Delaney for her unapproved garden gnome. And Frank, your tree branches are hanging over the fence by 2 inches. A fine will be imposed for that as well. A small one, of course, she added with a smile. But we must maintain order. The room was electric with tension. Frank's face reddened, and Mrs. Delaney's lips trembled. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming, but Karen was playing. Her hand. She was trying to break them one by one. John stayed quiet, observing, letting the heat of the room build. Then, in a move that no one saw coming, he spoke again. That's funny, he said, his tone light but carrying an undeniable edge. I don't recall seeing any official documents for this HOA. No legal paperwork, no signatures, nothing. Karen's eyes widened, her composure starting to crack. She leaned forward, venom dripping from her words. You think you can just come in here and question me? John smiled slightly, the room holding its breath. I'm not questioning you, Karen, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I'm exposing you. Karen's face twisted in confusion, but before she could respond, the sound of a distant siren echoed through the neighborhood. Her eyes darted to the window just as John made his move. He pulled out his badge. The air thickened with the realization. This wasn't just some neighborhood dispute. Karen was about to learn that John was more than just a neighbor. The sirens grew louder. The game had just changed. Karen stood in her living room, gazing out of the window with a smug satisfaction, her arms crossed tightly. The neighborhood was hers now. She had made sure of it. The power was intoxicating, flowing through her veins with every letter she sent, every warning she issued. She had everyone wrapped around her finger, bending to her will without realizing it. Today, she had handed out another round of official warnings, the kind that would force even the most stubborn residents to submit to her authority. It was all part of her plan. They were just too blind to see it. She'd already sent out a reminder about the mailbox colors, and now she was going after the next target, the Thompson family, who dared to hang a holiday wreath before Thanksgiving. How dare they? It was a clear violation of the seasonal decor guidelines she'd invented. Her mind was buzzing with thoughts of what she would do next. The fine structure was working. People were getting nervous, afraid of what she might do if they didn't comply. She could almost taste her victory. Just one more push, and she would have the entire block under her control. A knock at the door broke her train of thought. It was one of the neighbors, someone she hadn't expected. Karen, Mrs. Delaney, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, said, her voice quivering, I need to talk to you about this HOA business. My daughter is coming to visit, and— Not now, Mrs. Delaney, Karen snapped, already flustered. I'm busy. You should have thought about this before you put that ridiculous gnome in your yard. It's causing a disturbance in the community. I'm not going to repeat myself. Mrs. Delaney flinched, her face crumpling. But Karen, No more excuses, Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. If you want to keep living here, you'll follow the rules. You can't just throw whatever you like in your front yard. It's disrespectful to the rest of us. The older woman's eyes welled with tears, but Karen just slammed the door shut in her face, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had power. She controlled the narrative, and no one could touch her. The meeting later that evening was a reflection of her growing dominance. Karen stood at the front, issuing her usual demands. The residents were quiet, each one too afraid to speak out. She enjoyed the silence, the stillness that confirmed their submission. She was untouchable, above reproach. They had no choice but to listen. This is the 3rd warning I've issued. This month, Karen said, her voice echoing through the hall. The HOA will be enforcing stricter penalties going forward. We cannot tolerate disorder in our community. She raised her hand to silence the mutters of discontent. The Thompsons, sitting near the back, exchanged a nervous glance, but they knew better than to speak up. Now, Karen continued, her eyes sweeping the room, I've noticed some lapses in the enforcement of our seasonal decor rules. Mrs. Thompson, you've hung your holiday wreath too early. I'm issuing an official warning. You have 24 hours to remove it, or the fine will be issued. We can't have chaos in this neighborhood. The room held its breath. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth to protest, but Karen cut her off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. If you can't respect the guidelines, perhaps this isn't the place for you. John had been sitting quietly in the back corner, watching Karen's every move. The sharpness in her tone, the way she dismissed the residents, it was all part of the same act. She had no real authority, but Karen believed she did, and that made her dangerous. At first, John had hoped the neighbors would find a way to stand up for themselves. But now, he could see they were too intimidated to fight back. They had lost their voice in the face of her manipulation. As Karen's tirade continued, John noticed a few people casting anxious glances in his direction. They were starting to whisper to each other, their words muffled by the low hum of Karen's voice. And then, one by one, their eyes locked on him. He could feel their desperation. People who had reached their breaking point, yet were too afraid to confront her directly. It was one of the Thompsons who eventually approached him. The husband, Jim, leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "John," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. You've seen what she's doing. This can't go on. We need help." John nodded silently. He'd been expecting this moment, but now that it had come, it was far worse than he'd imagined. He looked around the room at the others. The whispers had grown louder, and a few more eyes turned to him, eyes full of fear and frustration. They wanted to fight back, but they were paralyzed by Karen's overconfidence. She had made them believe she was untouchable. Karen, sensing her power, was only growing bolder. She walked the room, eyes sharp, voice dripping with sarcasm, as she scolded neighbors for the most ridiculous offenses. "Greg," she said to the quiet man at the back, "you left your trash can out too long this week. That's a violation. I'll be issuing a fine." Greg's face turned red. He opened his mouth to protest, but Karen was already moving on, a smug grin on her face. "You're welcome to leave if you don't like it," she spat. "But no one is exempt. This is my community now, and I won't let anyone ruin it." As she spoke, her words became more venomous, more cutting. Her overconfidence was blinding her to the reality. The neighborhood was starting to crumble under her rule, and the cracks were beginning to show. John stood up slowly, making his way to the front. It was time to end this farce. But just as he reached the podium, Karen's voice rang out, icy and mocking. "What's this? The silent hero decides to make his move?" She sneered, clearly underestimating him. John didn't flinch. He had seen her kind before. The ones who thought they could control everything, until they met someone who was finally willing to expose their lies. With a single glance at the others, John spoke, his voice clear and steady. "This ends now." The air in the room froze. Karen's confident smirk faltered. It was time to show her the truth. The sun had barely set when John's doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent ring that echoed through his quiet house. He hadn't expected a visitor, but he knew who it was the moment he heard it. Karen. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coffee mug, the warm ceramic grounding him as he set it down on the kitchen counter. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting this. Karen had been escalating her behavior, becoming more brazen by the day. But now, this was it. She was coming for him directly. John stood, his movements deliberate and slow. His eyes darted briefly to the front window where he could see Karen, standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the self-appointed ruler she believed herself to be. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips, though it was far from warm. He had remained calm, watched her from the shadows, observed her petty rules and threats. But now it was time for the truth. Karen was about to learn just how out of her depth she truly was. He walked to the door, taking a deep breath before opening. "It's John," Karen said, her voice oozing faux sweetness. She was standing there in front of him, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, eyes gleaming with the kind of smug certainty that only someone like her could have. "I'm here to inform you that you've violated a few minor guidelines in our HOA charter. I'm afraid you'll be receiving a formal warning." John's gaze remained steady as he met her eyes, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in any hurry to respond. Let her talk. Let her believe she had control. "Minor offenses," Karen continued, her voice growing more authoritative. "You've been keeping your yard too untidy, and your mailbox color," she paused dramatically, "isn't the right shade of gray. These are violations that must be addressed, or fines will be issued. I don't want to escalate things, but you'll have to comply." John's lips parted slightly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had seen far worse than a woman with delusions of grandeur. "Karen," he said, his tone cool, "let me stop you right there." She blinked, slightly taken aback by the way he cut her off, but she didn't let it show. "What's the problem?" she asked, the forced cheeriness still in her voice, though a flicker of irritation was starting to show through. "I'm not the one with the problem," John replied, his hand moving slowly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. The tension in the air grew thicker with every second that passed. Karen tilted her head, clearly annoyed, but still convinced she had the upper hand. "You might want to reconsider your tone, John. I have every right to issue these warnings. And if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." John didn't flinch. He pulled the small leather wallet from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying for years, and opened it just enough for her to see the gold insignia inside. For a moment, it seemed like the world froze. Karen's eyes flicked down to the badge, her expression shifting from arrogance to confusion. It was only a fraction of a second, but the change was enough to unsettle her. Her hand tightened around the clipboard, her knuckles turning white. What is this?" she stammered, the words failing to catch up to her disbelief. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the space between them. The quiet of the street was broken only by the occasional rustling of the leaves, but it felt as though the entire world had grown still in that moment. "Karen," he said, his voice low and precise, "what you're doing is a crime." She blinked rapidly, still trying to make sense of what she was seeing. I don't know what you—" He cut her off, his voice sharp now. "Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal offense. It carries serious consequences. And here you are, parading around, sending out fake HOA warnings, bullying your neighbors, making them think you're some kind of authority figure." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as reality began to sink in. Her face had gone pale, her confidence evaporating as she realized just how much trouble she was in. "Don't think I haven't noticed," John continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've threatened fines, intimidated people, and made everyone think you were in charge. But you're not. You never were." Karen looked over her shoulder quickly, as if the neighbors might come to her rescue. But they were all watching. Every window was open now, eyes peering out into the quiet street, their faces filled with shock, disbelief, and the kind of fear that only comes when the truth is finally laid bare. A tense silence hung in the air. John could see her mind working, trying to calculate her next move. The bravado that had once seemed so effortless was slipping away, her shaky hands clutching at the clipboard as if it might somehow shield her from the reality of what was coming. "You can't just—" Karen started, her voice rising. But she was quickly interrupted. John's tone remained calm, even as he dropped the bombshell. "You're about to learn the hard way what happens when you cross the line. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now you've got the attention of the wrong person." Her face twisted, a flicker of anger rising within her. But it was clear. She was rattled. She tried to regain control, her voice faltering as she attempted to laugh it off. "Oh, please, you can't just come here and—" "Karen, you're done," John said, cutting her off once again, this time with more finality. "And, believe me, what happens next is going to make you regret everything you've done." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked desperately from John's unflinching gaze to the neighbors watching from their windows, before she stepped back, her composure completely unraveling. "This isn't over," she managed, her voice small, almost pleading. John remained steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Oh, it's over, Karen. You've just been exposed." With that, he turned and walked back into his house, the door closing softly behind him. Outside, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. The neighbors had been waiting for someone to stand up to her, but no one had expected this. The game had changed, and Karen was no longer the one in control. The real consequences of her actions were only just beginning. The sun was setting over the neighborhood, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. John stood on his porch watching as the first few lights flickered on in the houses around him. The quiet was almost eerie, broken only by the rustle of the trees and the occasional bark of a distant dog. But beneath the stillness, a storm was brewing. Ever since John had revealed his true identity as a U.S. Marshal, things had been unraveling quickly. The neighborhood was no longer the peaceful, sleepy place it once was. Tensions ran high, and the once unified front of Karen's self-appointed HOA was beginning to crack. Some neighbors, still terrified of Karen's overbearing tactics, had rallied to her side. They clung to her promises of order and structure, too afraid of what might happen if they didn't. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly woman who had once tried to confront Karen, was one of them. She stood at her window clutching a cup of tea, her face twisted with fear and confusion. Karen had convinced her that John was the real threat, that he was the one destabilizing their community. "They're just making up stories about me," Karen had whispered in her ear, her voice dripping with false concern. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to tear this neighborhood apart." But for every person like Mrs. Delaney, there were others who were beginning to see through Karen's lies. They had been living in fear for too long, intimidated by fines for the smallest offenses, pushed around by someone who had no real power. One by one, they started to reach out to John, sharing their stories, asking him to take action. They had learned the hard way what Karen was capable of, and they weren't going to sit back any longer. John's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Jim Thompson, one of the first neighbors to come forward. "We've got your back. We need to do this together." John couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had been working quietly, gathering evidence on Karen, tallying up the fake fines, tracking her intimidating letters, even recording some of her threats. He knew the pieces were all there. All it would take was the right moment to put everything in motion. But he also knew that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, within hours of John's confrontation with her, Karen had begun to retaliate. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, but not in the way John had hoped. Karen was whispering lies, painting him as the villain, turning everyone against him. "John's just here to cause trouble," she told anyone who would listen. "He's here to tear apart everything we've built. You have to protect this neighborhood from people like him. He's dangerous. He doesn't respect our rules. You've seen how he's acting, right?" The lies were simple, calculated, and they worked. Slowly but surely, a small group of Karen's loyal followers began to grow. They spread rumors, warned others to stay away from John, all while Karen continued her campaign of intimidation. It was a classic tactic. Make the other side seem like the enemy, and when that fails, destroy their reputation. John's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from one of his new allies, Greg. His voice crackled with frustration as he spoke. "They're spreading rumors about you, man. They're saying you're the one making trouble. I don't know how much longer we can keep this quiet before everyone turns on you. Karen's been working overtime. People are starting to believe her." John gritted his teeth, anger rising in his chest. He had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. He wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. He was fighting her web of lies and manipulation, a force that spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. But John wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when the truth was on his side. He had a case to build, and he was going to finish what he'd started. "I'll deal with it," John said, his voice cold. "Get the word out. I'll need more than just words to take her down. We need evidence." He hung up the phone and walked to his desk. Piles of paperwork were scattered across it, complaints, photos, letters, and emails. He began to sift through them, making mental notes. Each piece of evidence was a small victory, a step closer to exposing Karen for what she truly was. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Karen was too dangerous to just go quietly into the night. The next few days were tense. John kept a low profile, careful not to draw too much attention to himself. But every day it became clearer that the neighborhood was fracturing. There were whispers on the street corners, quiet meetings behind closed doors. Some neighbors were ready to stand up and fight, while others remained on the fence, unsure of which side to take. The pressure was mounting on Karen. Her attempts to control the situation were beginning to falter. The lies she spread were starting to lose their weight. But in the darkness, she had one last trick up her sleeve. A final card she would play. When she felt cornered, John wasn't prepared for it, not fully. But he would be. He had seen how people like Karen operated. They didn't stop until they had nothing left to lose. One evening, just as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, John received a message. It wasn't from one of his allies. It was from Karen. "Meet me at the park. We need to talk. The truth is coming out, but you don't want this to go public." John's eyes narrowed as he read the message. There was something in the way she phrased it, something that told him she wasn't done yet. The stakes were higher now. The neighborhood had split in two, and the battle was far from over. But John wasn't the type to back down. Not now. He grabbed his jacket, slipped on his boots, and headed out the door. The moment of truth was coming, and he wasn't going to let Karen control the narrative any longer. The game was about to change. Again. The courthouse was eerily quiet, its marble walls echoing every step, every whisper. John walked through the heavy doors, his mind focused, his heart pounding like a drumbeat. This was it, the final stage of a war that had been brewing for weeks. What had started as petty harassment from a self-proclaimed HOA leader had escalated into something far more dangerous, and now the truth would finally come to light. Karen stood on the opposite side of the courtroom, her eyes locked on John with a cold fury. She had pulled every string she could to get this far. The lawsuit she filed was nothing but a desperate play to maintain control, to salvage her crumbling empire. She had been playing the game with fire, thinking she could manipulate the neighborhood and the courts into believing her lies, but she hadn't expected John. As the judge entered, the room fell into silence. The gavel slammed, and the tension in the air thickened. Karen's attorney, a slick, well-dressed man, adjusted his tie and leaned over to whisper something in her ear. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her posture rigid. She was determined, but John knew her confidence was a mask. Beneath, it was a woman trapped, cornered by her own greed. John stood tall in the witness box, his expression stoic but resolute. He had been preparing for this moment for days, gathering every scrap of evidence he could find. Emails, bank records, photos, and testimonies from the neighbors who had been victimized by Karen's fake HOA rules. Everything led to one undeniable truth. Karen was a fraud. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the prosecution began. Karen's lawyer, confident in his client's fabricated narrative, made his case first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a case of a neighbor who has violated community standards. The defendant, Karen Johnson, established a set of regulations to ensure the well-being of this neighborhood. And now, we see a malicious attempt to tear down those efforts by the plaintiff." The lawyer paused, looking directly at John. "Mr. Harris has made baseless accusations in an attempt to discredit my client. It is clear that this lawsuit is just an effort to push back against lawful, well-intentioned guidelines." John's mind raced as he listened, but he remained calm. He knew how to handle this. He had faced far worse in his career as a U.S. Marshal. He could read people like a book, and Karen's lawyer was no different. The man was smooth, confident, but he was about to be exposed for what he really was, another pawn in Karen's game. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood and faced the jury, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what you're hearing here is a carefully crafted lie," John began. "What Karen Johnson has done is more than just bullying her neighbors. It's fraud. She has been running an unauthorized HOA, issuing fines for non-existent violations, and collecting money for them." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's face reddened, her jaw tightening. She shifted in her seat, but John could see the panic starting to rise in her eyes. John continued, walking the jury through the mountains of evidence. He presented the fake HOA rules Karen had drawn up, detailing every absurdity, from fines for minor lawn decor to fines for mailbox color. He showed bank records that revealed thousands of dollars funneled into an account Karen had set up in the name of the HOA, all while she posed as a legitimate authority figure. Then, he dropped. The final bombshell. A video recording of Karen herself, taken by a brave neighbor who had secretly filmed her threatening homeowners with fabricated fines. Karen's voice rang out clearly in the recording, boasting about her power and how she could make anyone pay if they didn't comply. The sound of her smug laughter filled the room. The gasps from the jury were almost deafening. John's eyes flicked to Karen, who was now visibly trembling, her hands shaking in her lap. She shot him a venomous look, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. "Karen Johnson," John said, his voice calm but cutting, "has been running a scam, exploiting the trust of this neighborhood for her own personal gain. She's not just guilty of impersonating an authority figure. She's guilty of theft, fraud, and extortion." The room was silent. The tension was unbearable. Karen's lawyer sputtered, trying to salvage what little credibility he had left, but the damage had been done. The truth was out in the open. Karen's face had gone white, her confidence shattered. She glanced nervously at the jury, then back at John. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She glanced at her attorney, then back at John, realizing that no amount of manipulation could save her now. Her empire of lies had crumbled. The judge, a stoic figure behind the bench, nodded toward the jury. "You've heard the evidence. It's time to deliberate." John turned away and sat back down, his pulse steady, his mind calm. The fight was over. The truth was undeniable, and Karen's downfall had been set in motion. As the jury filed out to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations. The atmosphere was electric with the anticipation of the inevitable verdict. John couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't over yet. He knew Karen would try to cling to the last remnants of her power, but he was ready for whatever came next. It wasn't long before the jury returned. The foreman stood up, his eyes scanning the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Johnson, guilty of all charges." The weight of the words hit like a tidal wave. Karen's face crumbled, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Her hands shook uncontrollably as the reality of the verdict sank in. The room erupted into whispers, but John remained calm, his eyes steady as they locked onto Karen's. She had lost. Her lies had unraveled. Justice had been served. The neighborhood, which had been divided for so long, began to heal. One by one, the neighbors who had been intimidated by Karen came forward, expressing their relief, their gratitude. They rallied around John, united in their support, knowing they had all been duped. But now, they were free. As John left the courthouse, his heart heavy with the weight of the battle, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of satisfaction. It had been a long road, but Karen's reign of terror had ended. And for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt like a place where peace might finally be restored. The neighborhood, once a battlefield of whispers and tension, now stood in the warm, quiet glow of a new beginning. The streets that had once been filled with hushed conversations and sideways glances were now alive with laughter, children playing, and neighbors greeting each other with genuine smiles. It had been weeks since the trial, weeks since Karen's fraudulent HOA had been dismantled, but the change was still palpable. People who had been cowering under Karen's reign of terror now walked with their heads high, no longer burdened by the threat of fines for the most trivial of infractions. The weight that had hung over them had lifted, and in its place, a sense of freedom had blossomed. John stood outside his modest house, watching the neighborhood slowly return to normal. He had played his part, gathering evidence, presenting the truth. But now, he blended back into the background, a quiet observer of the peace he had helped restore. The truth was out, and Karen's grip on the community had been shattered. He didn't seek thanks, didn't need accolades. John had never been one for attention. His work was the law, and the law was now serving justice. But even so, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in what had been accomplished. The neighborhood was safe again. As he walked down the street, several neighbors waved at him, offering nods of appreciation. One of them, an older man named Mr. Peterson, approached with a handshake. "Thank you, John," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "I don't know where this place would have ended up without you. You did the right thing." John simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just doing my job." But there was one last thing that needed to be addressed. Karen, word, had spread fast about the consequences she was facing. Her fraudulent HOA had been exposed, and the legal action was swift. She faced multiple charges: fraud, extortion, and impersonating an official authority. Her once powerful facade had crumbled, and now she was nothing more than a woman struggling to maintain any semblance of dignity. As John walked past the park, he saw her. She was standing near the edge of the sidewalk, her posture stiff, eyes darting around as if she could escape the whispers and stares of the neighbors. Her face was pale, her expression contorted with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She was making her final exit. John stopped, watching her for a moment. She had tried so hard to hold on to power, to control the narrative, but now she was defeated, her attempts to manipulate the situation falling apart. Karen glanced up, meeting John's eyes for a fleeting second, before quickly looking away. She knew it was over. With a huff, she straightened her shoulders and turned to walk away. But the sound of laughter from a group of neighbors who had gathered nearby caught her attention. The realization hit her hard. She was no longer the commanding figure she once believed herself to be. She was just another person, struggling to hold on to her crumbling reputation. "Goodbye, Karen," someone called out from the crowd, their voice dripping with mockery. Karen's face twisted with frustration. "You all have no idea how much I've done for this place," she sputtered, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "You'll regret this. You think this is over? You have no idea what I'm capable of." But her words fell flat. No one was listening anymore. The neighborhood had seen through her act, and now all she could do was stumble over her own excuses. Karen turned to leave, but the moment was lost. She wasn't the woman they had feared. She was just a hollow shell of the power she once pretended to wield. As she walked away, the laughter grew louder. Some of the neighbors even clapped, mocking her with their applause. The finality of it all hung in the air. John, standing at the edge of the crowd, couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its peace. Just as he turned to leave, a voice called out to him. It was Mrs. Delaney, the same woman who had once been terrified of Karen's rule. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with gratitude. I don't know how we would have done it without you. You saved us." John gave her a simple nod, his expression softening. "You saved yourselves," he said quietly. "You just needed the courage to stand up." As John walked away, the weight of the past few months began to lift. The quiet hum of life around him felt like a reward, like a promise that the peace he had fought for would last. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared into the distance. Her last attempt at dominance, nothing more than a distant echo. The neighborhood had moved on, and the final remnants of her power had slipped away, dissolving into nothingness. And for the first time in a long while, John felt the peace he had worked so hard to restore. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.